The room was loud, but his voice cut through it cleanly. My brother smiled the way people do when they think they are being clever. Still unmarried at 35 must be tough spending New Year's alone. A few people laughed, not loudly, just enough to make it feel agreed upon. I nodded once like I had not heard it before, like it was nothing new. Across the table, my mother avoided my eyes. My sister looked down at her glass. No one corrected him. No one ever did. I had learned over time that silence reveals more than arguments. And that night, as the countdown to midnight echoed from another room, I realized something I had been refusing to name. They were not just mocking me. They were hiding something. I have always preferred structure. Not because it made life easier, but because it made people easier to understand. When everything follows a pattern, the deviations become visible. And for most of my life, I believed my family followed a pattern I could trust. We were not particularly expressive. We did not say much, even during gatherings that were supposed to mean something. Birthdays passed with brief conversations. Celebrations were quiet, almost procedural. But there was consistency in it, and I took that consistency as a form of reliability. Every Sunday, we met at my parents' house. The same table, the same arrangement of chairs. My brother always sat to my father's right. I sat across from him. My sister stayed near the end, close to the kitchen. My mother moved between rooms, never fully sitting, always adjusting something that did not need adjusting. No one ever assigned these positions. They simply remained. I never questioned it. My brother filled space differently than the rest of us. He spoke more, but not in a way that invited conversation. His voice carried a kind of quiet certainty, the kind that made others pause before responding. When he made a comment, it lingered longer than necessary, even when it was meant as a joke. Especially then. He had a way of looking at people while speaking, holding eye contact just a moment too long, as if measuring their reaction. Most of the time, people laughed, not because it was particularly funny, but because it felt expected. I learned early not to respond too quickly. It was easier that way. I worked in a structured environment as well. Numbers, records, processes, things that did not shift depending on mood or tone. My days were predictable. I arrived at the same time, left at the same time, completed what was required without drawing attention. No one relied on me for anything beyond what was necessary, and I found that acceptable. There is a certain clarity in being overlooked. At home, it was similar. I was present, but not central. Decisions were discussed around me, not with me. Plans were mentioned in passing, often after they had already been made. It did not feel intentional at first. It felt like timing, like coincidence. I told myself that enough times that it became truth. My brother, on the other hand, was always involved. He knew things before they were said. He referenced conversations that had not included me. He spoke about future plans with a level of certainty that suggested they were already agreed upon. I assumed he simply paid more attention. Or that I did not ask enough questions. It never occurred to me that there was something else behind it. There were moments, of course, small ones, the kind that do not demand explanation on their own. A conversation that stopped when I entered the room. A glance exchanged too quickly to interpret. A decision mentioned casually that seemed to have more history than I was aware of. But each moment on its own was easy to dismiss. Individually, they meant nothing. Together, they still did not feel like enough, so I continued as I always had. I showed up on Sundays. I listened more than I spoke. I responded when necessary, remained quiet when it was not. My brother made his comments, often directed at me in a way that drew brief attention before moving on. "Still keeping everything in order," he would say sometimes, smiling slightly. I would nod. It was easier than explaining that order was the only thing that did not change. My mother never intervened. She would continue arranging plates, adjusting glasses, asking neutral questions that redirected the conversation without addressing it. My father remained mostly silent. When he did speak, it was brief and final, closing topics rather than opening them. My sister avoided tension altogether. She rarely looked directly at either of us during those moments. At the time, I interpreted this as balance. Everyone had a role. Everyone maintained it. And within that structure, I believed there was something steady. Something that did not need to be questioned. Trust does not always come from words. Sometimes it comes from repetition. From the belief that if something has remained the same for long enough, it must be stable. I did not realize then that repetition can also conceal things. That patterns can be maintained not because they are natural, but because they are useful. I did not see it. Not yet. Everything at that point still felt intact. Or at least, it felt close enough to intact that I did not look any further. The changes did not arrive in a way that demanded attention. They appeared gradually, in moments that felt incomplete on their own. Small shifts in tone, slight delays in response, conversations that seemed to begin before I entered and end shortly after. At first, I assumed it was timing. It is easy to blame timing when something does not make sense. One Sunday, I arrived earlier than usual. The front door was not fully closed. I could hear voices from the dining room, low, steady, more focused than our usual conversations. I stepped inside quietly, not intending to listen but not announcing myself either. My brother was speaking. "It's better if we keep it simple. No need to involve everyone." There was a pause. My mother said something, but her voice was too soft to make out clearly. Then my father responded briefly. I could not hear the words, only the tone. It was the same tone he used when something had already been decided. I walked into the room then. The conversation stopped, not abruptly, not in a way that would draw attention. It simply ended. My brother looked at me, then smiled in that familiar, measured way. "You're early," he said. I nodded once and took my usual seat. No one explained what they had been discussing. No one referenced it again. It should have felt insignificant. A conversation interrupted. Nothing more. And yet it stayed with me longer than it should have. Not because of what was said, but because of how easily it disappeared. After that, I began to notice similar moments. They were never direct, never clear enough to question openly. A phone call that ended when I entered the room. A message mentioned briefly, then dismissed before I could ask about it. My brother referencing something with my father, like we discussed, without any context that included me. Each time I told myself the same thing. It is nothing. You are not involved in everything. That is normal. And it was normal. At least it should have been. But normal things do not repeat with such precision. They do not follow the same pattern over and over without variation. There was also a shift in how I was addressed. My brother's comments became more frequent, though still framed lightly. "Still working late every day?" he asked once without looking up from his plate. "Yes," he nodded, as if confirming something to himself. "No time for anything else, I guess." The table remained quiet. I did not respond. It was not a question that required one. Another time, he leaned back in his chair and said, almost casually, "You ever think about how things would look if you weren't around as much?" It was said with a slight smile, the kind that made it unclear whether it was meant seriously. I looked at him. "In what sense?" I asked. He shrugged. "Just thinking out loud." No one followed up on it. My mother adjusted something on the table. My sister kept her eyes down. My father continued eating, unaffected. The moment passed, but it did not disappear. It stayed like the others. There was also a growing sense that decisions were happening without my awareness. Plans for repairs in the house, discussions about expenses, even small things like changes to family gatherings or schedules were mentioned only after they had already been set. You knew about this, right? My brother asked once, referring to something I had never heard before. I shook my head. He looked at me for a moment, then gave a short, almost dismissive laugh. We must have mentioned it. No one corrected him. I considered asking more questions. I did not, because each moment when isolated was still explainable. Miscommunication happens. People forget. Not everything needs to be shared. These were reasonable explanations, and I preferred reasonable explanations. They require less adjustment. Still, there was a difference between understanding something and feeling settled by it. I understood what was happening on the surface. I did not feel settled. There was a distance forming, not physical but structural. I was present in every gathering, yet increasingly separate from what was actually taking place within them. Like a detail that remained in the frame but was no longer part of the subject. I did not confront it. I did not ask for clarification. Instead, I began to pay closer attention, not in a way that would be noticed, just enough to observe patterns, to remember what was said, to notice what was not. At the time, I still believed there was nothing deliberate behind it, that it was a series of small, unrelated moments that happened to align. That belief remained intact, but it required more effort to maintain than it had before. And for the first time, I became aware of that effort, not enough to change anything. Just enough to recognize that something, however small, had shifted. And that whatever it was not moving back. It was not a single moment that changed my thinking. It was the accumulation. Patterns, when repeated often enough, stop feeling coincidental. They begin to suggest intention. And once that possibility exists, even quietly, it alters how everything else is interpreted. I did not confront anyone. I did not ask direct questions. Instead, I started paying attention in a way I had not before, not emotionally, not reactively, structurally. I began remembering details, phrases, timelines, small inconsistencies that would have once passed without notice. I did not write anything down, but I held on to them with a level of precision that came naturally to me. At first, it felt unnecessary. Then it started to feel required. One evening, my father mentioned something about repairs being done on a property. He spoke casually, as if continuing a conversation that had already been established. "They should be finished by next month," he said. My brother nodded. "Assuming there are no delays." I looked between them. "What repairs?" I asked. My father paused briefly, then responded without looking at me. "The old place." There was only one property that could refer to, a house that had belonged to our grandfather. It had been unused for years, though its ownership had never been formally discussed with me. I had always assumed it was something we all shared, or would eventually. "I didn't know anything was being done there," I said. My brother glanced at me, then back at his plate. "It came up recently," he said. "Nothing major." The way he said it felt incomplete, not inaccurate but reduced. "How recently?" I asked. He shrugged slightly. "A few weeks, maybe." That did not align with what my father had said. "They should be finished by next month" suggested something already underway. Something that required planning, approval, resources. Those things do not happen in a few weeks. I did not point that out. Instead, I nodded once and let the conversation move on. But it did not settle. Later that evening, I stepped outside briefly, not for any specific reason, just to create space away from the noise of the room. Through the partially open window, I could still hear voices inside, my brother again. "It's better this way, less complications." My mother said something in response. I could not hear the words, only the hesitation in her tone. My father followed with a short sentence. Then silence, not the natural kind, the kind that signals agreement. I stayed outside a little longer than necessary, not listening intentionally but not distancing myself either. When I went back in, nothing was mentioned. No one referenced the property again. No one included me in whatever had already been decided. That was the first time it felt structured, not a missed conversation. Not a simple oversight, but something organized, deliberate. After that, more details began to stand out. My brother referred to the property again days later during a phone call I overheard unintentionally. "Yes, we're handling it," he said. "Everything is already arranged." We, not I, but I had not been included. I began to consider possibilities I had avoided before: ownership, control, decision-making authority. These are not casual matters. They are defined, recorded, agreed upon, formally or otherwise. And yet I had no clear understanding of where I stood in any of it. That realization did not come with anger. It came with something quieter, a shift in assumption. I had always believed that my lack of involvement was incidental, that if something truly mattered, I would be included. Now, for the first time, I questioned that. What if exclusion was not accidental? What if it was consistent by design? I did not have enough information to answer that. But I had enough to recognize the pattern. And once recognized, it could not be unseen. Even small details began to carry more weight. A document left briefly on the table turned face down when I entered. A conversation that referenced numbers without context. My name mentioned once briefly, followed by a quick change of subject. Each moment was still small, still explainable if isolated, but they were no longer isolated. They formed a sequence, and that sequence pointed in one direction. Something was being managed, something that involved me. Without me, I did not confront it, not yet, because I still lacked something essential: clarity. And without clarity, any reaction would be premature, so I remained as I had always been, quiet, present, observing. But the difference now was not in what I saw, it was in how I understood it. Trust, once assumed, had begun to shift into something else. Not suspicion, not fully, but no longer certainty, and that was enough. Enough to change the way every future moment would be processed. Enough to make silence feel less like peace and more like concealment. I did not confront them all at once. That would have required certainty. What I had was alignment, details that pointed in the same direction, but nothing that could not be denied if presented too directly. And I understood something about my family that I had not fully acknowledged before. They did not respond to directness. They reshaped it. So I adjusted. I began asking questions carefully. Not accusations, not conclusions, just small, controlled requests for clarification that could not easily be framed as confrontation. The first time I did it, the response was immediate. We were sitting at the table again, the same arrangement, the same routine. My brother was speaking to my father about something related to the property, timelines, materials, costs. I waited until there was a pause. "Can you explain what's being done there?" I asked. My tone was even, neutral. My brother looked at me, then smiled slightly. "We already talked about it," he said. "No," I replied quietly. "You mentioned it, that's different." There was a brief silence, not long enough to be obvious, but long enough to be felt. My mother moved a plate that did not need to be moved. My sister looked down. My father did not speak. My brother leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression unchanged. "You're overcomplicating it," he said. "It's just maintenance." That word again, reduced, simplified. "Maintenance doesn't usually require this many discussions," I said. He gave a short laugh. "You're reading too much into it." The tone was light, but it landed differently. It was not a response to the question. It was a response to me, a quiet repositioning. The issue was no longer what was happening. The issue was how I was interpreting it. I did not push further, not because I accepted the answer, but because I recognized the pattern forming. Later that evening, my mother approached me in the kitchen. "You don't need to worry about these things," she said softly. "Your brother is handling it." "I'm not worried," I replied. "I just want to understand." She hesitated. "There's nothing to understand, it's already taken care of." That phrase stayed with me, already taken care of, without me. I nodded once and did not continue the conversation. Over the next few weeks, the responses became more consistent. Every question I asked was redirected. Not ignored, redirected. You're thinking too much. It's not that serious. You always focus on small details. You've been spending too much time alone. That last one came from my brother. It was said casually during dinner as if it were an observation rather than a statement with intent. Maybe that's why you're noticing things that aren't there. There it was. Not denial. Reframing. The suggestion was not that I was wrong about a specific detail. It was that my perception itself was unreliable, that I was constructing patterns where none existed. The rest of the table remained quiet. No one agreed with him openly, but no one disagreed either. Silence, again, became confirmation. I began to notice how quickly conversations shifted when I spoke. Questions dissolved into unrelated topics. Facts blurred into generalizations. Details became unnecessary. At one point, I referenced something my brother had said the previous week about timelines, about costs. He looked at me slightly puzzled. "I never said that," he replied. The certainty in his voice was precise, controlled. I did not argue. Instead, I asked, "Then what did you mean when you mentioned delays?" He paused for a moment, then smiled. "You must have misunderstood." There was no hesitation, no attempt to clarify, just a clean replacement of the original statement with a new version. And again, no one corrected him. I could feel the shift more clearly now. It was not just exclusion, it was adjustment. A quiet, consistent effort to reshape how I interpreted what I was seeing, to make doubt feel internal rather than external. I remained calm, not because I was unaffected, but because reacting would have confirmed the narrative they were building. So I did not react. I listened. I observed. I allowed them to continue without interruption. But internally, something had changed. I no longer questioned whether something was being hidden. That part was clear. What I began to understand was how it was being hidden, not through secrecy alone, but through distortion, through repetition, through the steady suggestion that what I noticed was not real, that what I remembered was incorrect, that what I felt was misplaced. And the most effective part of it was how subtle it remained. Nothing extreme, nothing overt, just enough to create uncertainty. Not in them, in me. Or at least that was the intention. But there is a limit to how much distortion can hold, especially when patterns continue to align, especially when details remain consistent, even when explanations do not. I did not confront them again, not in that way, because by then I understood something important. The truth was not going to be given to me through conversation. It was already documented somewhere else, in decisions, in records, in things that could not be adjusted after the fact. And if I wanted clarity, I would have to find it there. Clarity did not arrive all at once. It surfaced in fragments, small, separate confirmations that did not seem significant individually, but aligned too precisely to ignore. Unlike conversations, these fragments did not shift when observed. They remained fixed, unchanged by tone or interpretation. That was the difference. I did not change my behavior at home. I continued attending the Sunday gatherings. I spoke when necessary, remained quiet when it was not. My brother continued as before, controlled, composed, occasionally dismissive in ways that drew brief attention and then dissolved into routine. Nothing outwardly escalated. But outside of those gatherings, I began to look in places where responses could not be altered in real time. The first confirmation came through something unintentional. A call from a number I did not recognize. I almost did not answer. When I did, the voice on the other end was formal, measured. They introduced themselves as someone handling documentation related to the old property. There had been an issue, something procedural, something that required clarification. They used my full name, not casually, not as a reference, as an involved party. That was the first point that did not align with what I had been told. "I think there may be a mistake," I said. "I haven't been involved in anything related to that property." There was a brief pause, then the person responded carefully. "Your name appears on the records. We just need confirmation regarding a recent authorization." Authorization. The word settled in a way nothing else had. "I didn't authorize anything," I replied. Another pause, longer this time. "I understand," they said. "It may be best if you review the documents directly." They did not elaborate. They did not need to. After the call ended, I did not react immediately. I sat with it. Not the emotion, there was very little of that at first, but the structure of what had just occurred. My name was being used, formally, in something that required authorization. Without my knowledge, that removed any remaining ambiguity. This was no longer about exclusion. It was about involvement without consent. Over the next few days, I began to follow that thread. Quietly, carefully, I requested access to the documents referenced in the call. Not through confrontation, not through my family, but through the same formal channel that had contacted me. The process took time. But time, in this case, worked in my favor, because nothing could be altered once it had been filed. When I finally received the documents, I reviewed them alone. Line by line, there were signatures, approvals, timelines, and there clearly was my name, attached to decisions I had not made, authorizations I had not given. It was not forged in the obvious sense. It was structured more carefully than that, positioned in a way that suggested inclusion without requiring direct verification. Enough to pass, enough to proceed, but not enough to withstand scrutiny. I read through everything more than once, not because I needed to confirm what I was seeing, but because I needed to understand how it had been done, and more importantly, who had done it. The answer was not stated directly, but it did not need to be. The decisions aligned with the conversations I had overheard. The timelines matched the moments I had questioned. The language used in the documents reflected the same controlled simplification my brother used when speaking. Nothing explicit, everything implied. That was his method. I did not confront him. Not then. Because I understood something now that I had not fully grasped before. Confrontation would not reveal anything new. It would only give him the opportunity to reshape it. Instead, I continued gathering, not obsessively, not emotionally, just enough to ensure that what I had was complete. During this time, another detail surfaced. A relative distant, not closely involved in our immediate family, mentioned the property casually during a brief conversation. "I heard things are finally being sorted out there," they said. I looked at them. "What do you mean?" They hesitated, then shrugged slightly. "Your brother said it's all under control now, that everyone agreed." Everyone. I nodded once. "I see." They did not realize the weight of what they had confirmed. They were not part of it. They were only repeating what they had been told. But that was enough, because it showed how the narrative had been extended beyond the immediate circle, how it had been presented, unified, agreed upon, final, without me. That was when the structure became fully visible. This was not a series of isolated decisions. It was coordinated, communicated, maintained. And I had been placed within it as a participant without ever being included. I returned to the documents again that night, not to re-examine the details, but to confirm something else. Consistency, every element aligned, no contradictions, no gaps, which meant one thing: this had not been rushed, it had been planned, carefully, deliberately, over time. And the most consistent element in all of it was my brother, his language, his timing, his presence in every stage of the process. It was not assumption anymore, it was structure. And structures, once exposed, do not collapse immediately. They hold for as long as they are allowed to. I did not interrupt it. I did not reveal what I knew. Because at that point I understood the value of timing, not emotional timing, procedural timing. There were still parts of this that had not surfaced, still elements that needed to be seen clearly, and I was no longer interested in partial understanding. If this had been built over time, then it would reveal itself the same way, quietly, completely, and without needing to be forced. Once I understood the structure, the rest became easier to see. Not because anything changed dramatically, but because I no longer interpreted events at face value. Every interaction, every pause, every carefully chosen word, each of them began to fit into something larger. And at some point, without me saying anything, my brother noticed. It was not immediate, but it was precise. The first shift came in how he spoke to me. The tone remained controlled, but there was a subtle adjustment, less casual, more measured, as if he was no longer certain how much I understood. We were at the table again, the same arrangement, the same routine that had remained unchanged for years. He mentioned the property briefly, speaking to my father. "We should finalize everything by the end of the month," he said. I did not respond. I did not look up. I simply continued eating. That was enough. A few seconds passed, then he added, almost deliberately, "No complications so far." It was not directed at me, but it was meant to be heard. I set my fork down and looked at him. "For whom?" I asked. The question was simple, neutral, but it altered the room. My brother held my gaze for a moment longer than usual. Then he smiled. "For anyone involved," he said. There was a slight emphasis on the last word, involved. I nodded once and returned to my plate. I did not ask anything further, but something had shifted. He had adjusted his language, not to clarify, but to contain. After that, the changes became more visible. Conversations that once happened openly at the table began to move elsewhere. Phone calls were taken in other rooms. Discussions were shortened or redirected more quickly when I was present. Inclusion, which had already been limited, became almost non-existent. It was no longer subtle. It was controlled. At one point, I arrived at my parents' house to find the living room empty, but voices coming from behind a closed door. That door had never been closed during gatherings before. I did not approach it. I did not listen. I simply waited in the hallway until the voices stopped and the door opened. My brother stepped out first. He paused when he saw me, not surprised, not exactly, but aware. "You're here," he said. "Yes." He nodded, then moved past me without further comment. No one explained what had been discussed. No one referenced the closed door, but the message was clear. Boundaries had been drawn, not spoken, but enforced. There were also attempts to redefine how I was perceived within the family, subtle at first, then more consistent. "He's been distant lately," my brother said one evening, speaking to my mother, but loud enough for me to hear. "Working too much," he added. My mother nodded, though she did not look at me. "You should try to relax more," she said softly. It was not concern, it was alignment. A quiet reinforcement of a narrative that positioned me as separate, detached, less involved by choice. I did not correct it, because correcting it would require engaging with it. And engagement would only give it more space to exist. Instead, I remained consistent, present, calm, unchanged. That seemed to unsettle him more than any reaction would have. The more I did not respond, the more controlled his behavior became. Not outwardly aggressive, not confrontational, but tighter, more deliberate. There were moments when he would pause mid-sentence as if reconsidering what to say in front of me. Moments where he would shift topics abruptly. Moments where he would watch me, not openly, but carefully, measuring whether I would speak. I did not. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I no longer needed to. The information I required was no longer coming from conversation. It was already documented, already structured, already in motion. And that was where the real pressure began to build, not in the room, but beneath it. Because systems, once engaged, follow their own timeline. They do not respond to tone. They do not adjust to narrative. They proceed. And I knew from what I had already seen that there were still processes underway, authorizations that had been submitted, decisions that had been formalized, actions that could not simply be undone without consequence. My brother knew this as well. I could see it in the way his confidence shifted, not disappearing, but tightening, becoming more controlled, less expansive, as if he was managing variables, accounting for possibilities, including one he had not considered before, that I was no longer uninformed, still silent, still outwardly compliant, but no longer unaware. The escalation did not come from confrontation. It came from proximity, from the fact that I remained present while no longer fitting into the role that had been assigned to me. That created tension, not visible to anyone outside the immediate structure, but clear within it. And tension, when sustained, leads to exposure, not immediately, not dramatically, but inevitably. I did not accelerate it. I did not interfere. I allowed it to continue. Because at that point, I understood something with certainty. This was no longer about whether the truth would surface. It was about when, and more importantly, how much of it would surface when it did. There is a moment when uncertainty ends, not because every detail is known, but because enough has aligned that doubt no longer serves a purpose. It becomes unnecessary, something that delays rather than protects. For a long time, I remained in that space between knowing and confirming, observing, collecting, allowing patterns to form without interrupting them. But eventually, the structure became too clear to ignore, not just in documents, not just in conversations, but in what it required from me. Silence up to that point had been a way to understand. Now it became a decision, one that carried weight, because once you recognize a deliberate act, something planned, sustained, and maintained over time, you are no longer simply observing it. You are positioned within it, and that position demands something. Not reaction, but choice. I did not feel anger in the way most people expect. There was no sudden surge, no need to confront or expose. What I felt was quieter, a kind of internal recalibration. I began to revisit past moments, not emotionally, but structurally. Conversations that once felt insignificant, comments that seemed casual, decisions I had not been part of. They rearranged themselves under this new understanding. What I had interpreted as personality was method. What I had dismissed as oversight was consistency, and what I had trusted as stability was control. That realization carried a different kind of weight, not sharp, but heavy, because it did not point to a single action. It pointed to time, years of it, years in which I had remained in the same position, believing it was natural, believing it was balanced, when in reality it had been maintained. I stopped expecting anything to change through conversation. That expectation disappeared completely. Not out of frustration, but out of clarity. There was no version of this where my brother would acknowledge what had been done in a direct, unfiltered way. There was no version where my family would suddenly shift their alignment. They had already chosen their positions, quietly, consistently, and they had maintained them. That was enough. The question then became, what was I going to do with that understanding? Not emotionally, practically. I had already seen the documents, already confirmed the structure. There were processes in motion that could not be undone without consequence. Legal, financial, things that operated independently of conversation. That was where the truth existed now, not in what was said, but in what had been recorded. I considered confronting him directly, not for answers, but to observe his response. I decided against it because I already knew the response. It would be controlled, measured, adjusted in real time to maintain the existing narrative. There would be no clarity there. Only more distortion. and I was no longer interested in distortion. What I needed was finality, not in the sense of resolution, but in the sense of completion. A point at which everything that had been set in motion would reach its natural outcome, without interference, without acceleration. I also understood something else at that point. Whatever happened next would not restore anything, not trust, not relationships, not the structure that had existed before. Because that structure had not been what I believed it was, it had been something else entirely. And once seen, it could not be returned to its previous form. That acceptance was the breaking point, not loud, not visible, but definitive. I stopped interpreting their behavior as something that needed to be understood. I stopped looking for explanations within the family itself. I stopped expecting acknowledgement. Instead, I shifted my attention entirely to what existed outside of it. The systems already in place, the records already filed, the processes already moving forward. That was where the outcome would be decided. Not by me, not by them, but by something that did not adjust itself to protect anyone involved. And for the first time, that felt appropriate. Not satisfying, not relieving, but accurate. At the next family gathering, nothing appeared different. The same table, the same arrangement. My brother spoke as he always did. My mother moved between rooms. My father remained mostly silent. My sister avoided tension, and I remained present, unchanged on the surface, but no longer participating in the same way. I listened, I observed, but I did not engage with anything that required interpretation, because interpretation had already been replaced by understanding. And understanding, once complete, does not ask for confirmation. It waits for the outcome, whatever that may be. I did not rush it. I did not resist it. I allowed it to move forward at its own pace, because at that point I knew something with certainty. This was no longer about discovering the truth. That part was done. This was about what the truth would do once it reached a point where it could no longer be contained. The shift did not begin at the table. It began elsewhere, quietly, in places where conversations could not adjust outcomes. I was not present when the first formal response was issued. I did not need to be. By that point, everything had already been set in motion. The documents I had reviewed, the authorizations I had questioned, the inconsistencies that had aligned, those were no longer isolated observations. They had entered a system that required verification. And systems, unlike people, do not ignore discrepancies. The first sign reached me indirectly, a follow-up call. The same measured tone, the same controlled formality. There had been a review. Certain elements required clarification. Not optional clarification required. I listened without interrupting. There was no urgency in their voice, no accusation, just process. That was enough. Within a few days, the atmosphere at home began to change, not dramatically, not in a way that could be easily described, but the consistency I had once relied on, the predictability of tone, of rhythm, started to shift. My brother spoke less, not in quantity, but in certainty. His statements, once precise and conclusive, became shorter, more contained, as if each word was being considered before it was allowed to exist. My father asked more questions, small ones, clarifying ones, not directed at me, directed at him. "When was that approved?" he asked once. My brother responded, but not immediately. "It was handled already," he said, that phrase again. But this time it did not settle the conversation. My father did not respond. He simply nodded slowly, not in agreement, in acknowledgement. There is a difference. My mother became quieter, not just in conversation, but in movement. The small adjustments she used to make, rearranging plates, shifting objects, happened less frequently. She sat down more often, stayed still longer, as if there was nothing left to manage. My sister avoided eye contact almost entirely, not just with me, with everyone. Silence, which had once felt structured, began to feel uncertain. not empty, unstable. At one point, a letter arrived, addressed formally. Not opened at the table, not mentioned immediately, but it remained there, visible for longer than it should have. My brother saw it. I watched the moment he recognized it. There was no visible reaction, no change in posture, but something in his expression tightened, slightly, controlled. He picked it up later without comment and moved it out of sight. No one asked about it. No one referenced it. But the presence of it had already done what it needed to do. It had introduced something that could not be dismissed. External confirmation, not from me, not from within the family, from outside. That changed the structure, because internal narratives can be maintained. External ones cannot be reshaped so easily. Over the following days, more signs appeared, not openly, but consistently. Phone calls that lasted longer, doors that remained closed longer than before, conversations that did not happen at the table anymore, and when they did, they were fragmented. Incomplete, as if parts had been removed before being allowed to surface. My brother no longer made comments directed at me, not about my work, not about my personal life, not about anything. It was not avoidance. It was adjustment, a reallocation of focus, away from control toward containment. At one gathering, my father spoke more than usual, not directly about the situation, but around it, referencing timelines, asking about processes, clarifying details that until then had been accepted without question. My brother answered, carefully, but not with the same certainty he once had. There were pauses now, small ones but noticeable, and in those pauses something became clear. The structure he had built was no longer fully under his control, not because it had been taken from him directly, but because it had been placed into a system that did not respond to control in the same way. It responded to accuracy. And accuracy, once questioned, does not restore itself easily. I did not speak, not during those moments, not after, because there was nothing I needed to add. Everything that needed to surface was already doing so. Through the only channels that could not be redirected, records, processes, verification. The consequences were not immediate. They did not arrive all at once. They unfolded gradually, in shifts of tone, in changes of behavior, in the quiet erosion of certainty. No one acknowledged it directly. No one named it, but it was present in every pause, in every unfinished sentence, in every moment where something that once felt stable no longer held. And through all of it, I remained where I had always been, at the table, in the same seat, observing, not as someone trying to understand, but as someone who already did, waiting not for confrontation, but for completion. The new year arrived without announcement. There was no gathering this time. No coordinated dinner, no familiar arrangement of chairs or carefully repeated routines. The house remained quiet, not in the way it used to be, structured, predictable, but in a way that felt unresolved. I did not receive a message from my brother, not that day, not after. Communication, like everything else, had adjusted, reduced, contained. The processes that had begun weeks earlier continued forward. I was informed when necessary, through formal channels in language that did not require interpretation. Reviews, corrections, confirmations, each step documented, each outcome recorded. Nothing dramatic, nothing immediate, just a steady movement toward conclusion. I did not attend every meeting. I did not need to. The outcome was no longer dependent on presence, only on what had already been established. At some point, the property was no longer discussed within the family at all. Not avoided, removed, as if silence could replace what had been exposed. My father spoke less. My mother stopped trying to maintain conversation. My sister remained distant, and my brother remained quiet, not in the same way I had been, not observational, not restrained, but limited, as if every word now required consideration beyond the room. We sat together once more, briefly, days after the new year, the same table, the same seats, but nothing else remained the same. No one mentioned the past. No one acknowledged what had happened. There was no apology, no explanation, only the absence of what had once filled the space. I finished my meal before the others, not intentionally, just naturally. When I stood to leave, no one stopped me. No one asked where I was going. I paused for a moment, not expecting anything, just observing what remained. Then I left. Outside, the air was still. No noise, no countdown, no expectation of anything beginning again. For the first time, being alone did not feel like something that needed to be explained. It did not feel like absence. It felt defined, clear, not by what was said, but by what had been revealed and allowed to remain. There was no resolution, only understanding, and that was enough.